Today we're making a low-carb beef stew in my low-carb kitchen with a special ingredient, no potatoes, radishes instead. One of my favorite comfort foods has been beef stew. I'd always make it come the fall. The problem is it never really loved me back, and that's partly because of the ingredients I would always add into it, which make a great beef stew. Potatoes, carrots, peas, potatoes, all the things that make it tasty, but very, very high carb. So what I'm going to do today is show you how to make a beef stew that is low in carbs, that's still just as enjoyable and still provides the comfort that we all crave, especially as we start heading into the colder months now. So what I'm putting into mine is basically, I got my beef. I'm just using beef stew that I got at the grocery store. I'm adding some bacon to it. So that's my meats that are going into it. But I'm also adding low carb vegetables. So I've got mushrooms, and the important thing with beef stew you want to remember is 1 inch. So your vegetables need to be pretty chunky, so about 1 inch in size. So when I slice these up, they are just that, 1 inch. So I've got mushrooms, just button mushrooms. I'm using celery. My potato replacement is, ta-da, the radish. Yes, radishes. They actually, I was surprised by this, but when you cook them, just like any other root vegetable, they actually take to cooking very well. And the bite mellows out when you cook them, so they don't have the really strong flavor to them. They mellow out. They actually get a little sweet when you cook them too, but just a nice thing to add when you're in the kitchen and cooking or baking, roasting vegetables or putting them in a stew. Radishes are really nice. I'm using different colored bell peppers. I'm using, that sort of is my vegetables. I'm using onion, yes, it's a vegetable, but more as flavor. I'm using a very small onion that I'm going to be using. I'm using a can of tomatoes, sauce completely drained out. That's really important because your stew, you want as little liquid as possible, just enough to cover. I'm using some minced garlic here. And then for my the rest of my flavoring, I'm using a smoked sea salt, just regular pepper. This is going to use to season my meat. I'm using tomato paste. That's also going to help thicken it a little bit. And then I also have some just garlic and oregano mixed in together. And this is actually going to go in at the end, near the end of the cooking time. And then for my liquid, I got some beef broth, about 2 cups of it. And normally I used to put in Worcestershire sauce in my beef stew. The problem is, there's molasses in it and sugar, so that makes it not so great. So instead, I'm using coconut amino as part of it instead. It has the same amount of carbs as Worcestershire, which is about 1 carb per teaspoon. However, no sugar is involved with this, which is great. It has a lot of great nutrients like vitamin B, vitamin C, so it has a lot of good flavor that it adds to it, as well as it's extremely healthy. So that's going to go in. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clear off this whole area and I'm going to start prepping my meat. Now, let me just pause and say one thing. If you're in a rush in the morning and you just want to throw it in a crock pot, go right ahead. You can take all these ingredients and just throw it straight in, and when you come home, it's going to be tasty. What I'm just going to show you is how to make it a little more tastier with what I'm going to do with the meat to prep it for cooking. So with that, let's go ahead and let's start getting this puppy going. All right, so what I'm going to do with the meat is I'm going to cut it to size because I've already gone through my bowl over here and most of the meat is perfectly fine. It's basically like that size, which is what I want. So I'm going to chuck that in there. The problem is when I got a sucker like this, it just won't cook evenly in the crock pot. So I'm going to just take it and I'm just going to cut it and then cut it again. And it's that simple. That's all I'm doing. I'm just cutting it to size. And some of it, you don't really, I mean, that's the piece where I actually had to cut the meat, but here it's just where it's connected by fat. So I'm just going ahead and just cutting those pieces. But basically, that's what I'm going to do, and then the next thing I'm going to do is season my meat. All right, my meat is all chopped up into about 1 inch size cubes, a little bit bigger, a little bit, or, you know, around there. So we're all set there. What I'm going to do is just go ahead and season the meat, and I'm just going to be using a couple of pinches of smoked sea salt. And then I'm also going to use black pepper. And all I'm going to do is just use my hands. Now you may have noticed, I switched from gloves to hands to gloves to hands. Well, I didn't want to dip after working with the meat into my salt and pepper because those I can put back into the container, or I'm going to use them for other dishes. So didn't want to contaminate with raw meat. Anyway, you just sort of mix everything. And with that, my meat is now ready to sear. All right, I'm heating up my pan. When you're searing meat, you don't want to use a nonstick pan simply because the meat won't stick. You do want it to stick to create that sear. I'm not cooking the meat on the stove, I'm just searing it. So the inside should be completely raw when I'm done with it. What I'm using my cast iron. You can also use a stainless steel pan. That works well. You want to have it on its highest setting. If you're using something like an enameled skillet or Dutch oven, don't put it to its highest because you can crack the enamel. So a little safety tip for you. I'm using my cast iron. I'm using beef tallow since I'm using beef. I'm using about a tablespoon, but I'm also adding in a little bit of ghee. A lot of times I used to sear with butter, but the butter would burn, but it would add a nice little flavor or color. So I'm switching out the butter with ghee because ghee has a very, very high smoke point. So this is heating up, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start adding the meat. You don't want to crowd the meat. That's really important. I always do this to test. Yeah, that's what I want. So the meat's going to go on. That's a piece that's a little crowded. The smaller the piece, the closer to a minute is when you lift it. And the meat will naturally stick to the pan. See, that won't even move. And what will happen is in about a minute or two, the meat will actually release itself. All right, I'm searing. This is the color you want on it. The smaller pieces I'm taking out. I'm going ahead and just removing them because I don't want them to cook too fast because they will cook all the way through. But what I'm doing is I'm just searing it for the color. That's what I want to see. All right, so my meat is done. I've got the color that I want. The pan is still hot. I'm turning down the heat just slightly, not by much, but just slightly. I'm going to go ahead and add my onions. I'm going to saute the onions, the garlic. Through the cooking process, what I did was I added more ghee and more tallow. I cooked the meat in batches again, so I didn't overcrowd it. And as I needed to, I would add more healthy fats to it to make sure nothing got too hot or burnt. What I'm doing right now is when you cook the meat and you sear it, there are bits that stick to the bottom, the brown bits. That's not burnt. That's flavoring. It's caramelized. So I'm adding that here. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing now with the mushrooms too. You can do this if you want to with all of your veggies. I'm just going to do it with these three. And I'm just going to cook it for about a minute more. Okay, I took everything, all of the onions and garlic and mushrooms out of the pot, out of the skillet. I've already added them to my slow cooker. And what I'm going to do now is I'm deglazing my pot, essentially. I'm trying to get up all those bits and pieces from the steak and from the mushroom and garlic and onion. This is just adding flavor. I just used a little bit of my broth to do this. All right, I add the deglazed or the liquid from the pan, from my skillet into my crock pot, and you can see I already have some of the vegetables in there. Now I'm just going to start layering everything. I put my vegetables on top first, and that's primarily something I found out about crock pots is their heat zone, the primary heat zone, is on the bottom, which makes sense because this is sitting inside of here. If you put your meat in there, it's going to cook way too fast, and you don't want that to happen. So now what I'm going to do, I've got my vegetables there. I'm going to add my meat on top. All the juice that was in here that accumulated go in there with it. I'm going to add my bacon on top. Scatter around. I use about a packet of bacon, so it's about not quite a pound. Maybe about a couple of ounces or a couple of ounces shy of a pound. I'm going to add in my tomatoes. This is part of the flavoring, although it adds some tomatoes here too. So I'm adding the rest of my bone broth. And I'm probably going to add a little bit more since it's not covering my meat, but that's okay. And then I'm going to add a few dashes of this good stuff right there. So I'm probably going to add a little bit more broth because I want to cover my meat. Before I do that, I'm going to add my tomato paste. Again, when I add a little bit more liquid, I'm going to mix that all together. So I'm going to just start smearing that. All right, I just added just a little bit more so it's at even with the meat right now, and I'm just sort of pressing down, getting the meat under, a little bit under. You don't want to add a whole lot because the liquid doesn't evaporate out of a crock pot, and the whole point of this is you want a broth that's a little bit thick. You don't want anything way too soupy. So, but it's still good. It's just become a beef soup as opposed to a stew. And also, a lot of water is going to get released from the vegetables. That's the other thing. So there's going to be a lot more liquid in here. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and set my timer to 6 to 8 hours on low, and about an hour before I am done, before this is actually done, I'm going to add in then my seasonings to it, because I want to maximize this flavor of the seasonings. And if you put it in early, sometimes the crock pot can just sort of steal that flavor away from you. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and get this turned on, and in about 6.5 hours, 6 hours or so, I'll have some tasty stew. It's been about 6 hours. The stew is done. It's all set. The meat is really, really tender. I've been playing with it a little bit. I already went ahead and cut into a radish. I'm going to cut into it again. See, it's very tender. They've lost all their color. The red is gone. I'm going to go ahead and take a quick bite. There is no harshness to the radish. It doesn't have that sharp taste to it, that heat that it usually has when it's raw. It's very much has a texture of a potato, not quite as soft as a potato, but it's very yummy, has a little sweetness to it, but it tastes so good in this dish. And the rest, it just, with the sauce and everything, it's just delicious. I hope you give it a shot this fall or winter on those cold nights and you need some comfort. This is a great recipe for you to go ahead and try. And if you like the video, go ahead, subscribe, give it a thumbs up. And until next time, I'll see you.